German soldiers had imagined captivity in America as a place of hard labor, punishment, and slow starvation. For years they had been fed stories of a weak and decadent society, a nation too soft to survive war. So when the first groups of German POWs stepped off trains into the interior of the United States, blinking in the unfamiliar brightness of Texan, Oklahoman, or Georgian sunlight, they braced themselves for the worst. Their uniforms were worn, their boots caked with the dust of distant battlefields, and many had spent weeks packed into Liberty ships without knowing what awaited them on the other side. What they found instead was something none of them had imagined: the sweet smell of vanilla drifting from a mess hall, the clinking of glass bottles filled with a dark, carbonated liquid, and American guards casually sipping Coca-Cola as if it were water. It was a first crack in the worldview they had carried through the war. The camps had been built quickly yet functionally, designed to house tens of thousands of Axis captives scattered across the American heartland. Fences were tall but not oppressive, guard towers present but almost relaxed. Most German POWs were stunned not by the physical structure of the camps but by the absence of hatred in the eyes of the American personnel. The guards treated them more like detained workers than mortal enemies. They were checked, counted, assigned bunks, and brought to the mess hall for their first meal on American soil. There, waiting for them on long metallic counters, was a dessert that many had seen only in American films: ice cream. Some POWs laughed, thinking it was a joke. Others stared with suspicion, trying to decide whether it was truly food or some kind of trick. One soldier from the Afrika Korps later wrote in his diary that he had not seen ice cream since before the war and had never believed it could be made in such quantity. The Americans seemed to have it constantly, both in the heat of summer and the cold of winter. To the Germans, who had grown up on stories of America as a land of economic instability and moral decay, the sight of prisoners being served ice cream was difficult to process. They looked around, waiting to see if the guards would laugh at their shock. The guards didn't laugh. They told them simply, "Eat, there's more if you want it." Coca-Cola was even more astonishing. To a German soldier, the drink had been a near mythical luxury mentioned only in pre-war magazines. Some had tasted its German substitute, Africola, but few had ever tried the original. And now, in a country they had been taught to despise, they watched American guards purchase bottle after bottle for 5 cents each, drinking without care or rationing. The prisoners learned quickly that the soft drink was available in canteens, PX stores, and sometimes even from vending machines that seemed to produce an endless supply. One POW joked that America must have so much sugar that it could afford to pour it into bottles and hand it out freely even during wartime. Another wrote to his family that he had seen more Coca-Cola in a single day than he had seen real coffee in the entire last year of fighting. Meals in the camps ranged from simple army rations to lavish spreads on holidays. Most German POWs had entered captivity underweight, exhausted, and chronically underfed. Yet within weeks many began gaining weight, their bodies responding to the surplus of calories. They could hardly believe that the food they were eating, meat, bread, vegetables, chocolate, milk, was the standard fare of a country at war. They marveled at the fact that Americans, despite fighting on fronts across the world, still had enough to provide full meals to enemy soldiers. Red Cross inspectors reported again and again that German prisoners were healthier in American camps than German civilians living under Allied bombing. One of the most astonishing experiences for the prisoners came during their first Thanksgiving in captivity. They had never heard of the holiday, and earlier rumors of a special meal made many nervous. Instead, they were served turkey, stuffing, potatoes, gravy, cranberry sauce, vegetables, pie, and of course, ice cream. The guards ate the same meal alongside them, laughing and chatting. To the Germans it felt surreal. It was the warmth of the atmosphere that unsettled them most, because they had expected hatred and instead found something that looked suspiciously like respect. A corporal from Bavaria later said that the Thanksgiving dinner was the first moment he realized the war was truly lost, not militarily, but ideologically. A society capable of such abundance could not be weak. The POWs were allowed to work on farms, in lumber mills, and occasionally in factories, earning small wages that they could use in the camp canteens. With their money, many bought American chocolate bars, Hershey's, Baby Ruth's, Butterfingers, and carefully wrapped them to send home in packages permitted by the Red Cross. They imagined their families opening these candies back in Germany. where children were lucky to get a single sweet during the entire war. Some prisoners wrote apologetic letters saying they wished they could send bread or medicine, but since they couldn't, they hoped chocolate might bring a moment of happiness to their families. For many German children, the chocolate bar that arrived from an American POW camp became the first taste of the United States they ever encountered. Liberty ships transporting POWs to and from camp work sites sometimes served ice cream on board, a detail the Germans struggled to accept. To them, the ocean journey should have been a grim experience. Instead, they watched American sailors line up for cones or bowls of vanilla, chocolate, or strawberry ice cream. They saw the ship's cooks casually throw away leftovers that would have fed entire families in Germany. The POWs were stunned not at the waste itself, but at what it represented. America's war machine was so productive, its economy so enormous, that it could throw away what other nations rationed with trembling care. The abundance was not only shocking, it was embarrassing. It made a mockery of the Nazi ideology that had told them America was a nation of weaklings incapable of sacrifice. Some POWs tried to resist this ideological unraveling. They clung to the belief that American prosperity was superficial or temporary. But the longer they remained in captivity, the harder it became to maintain those illusions. They saw American guards who were young, confident, well-fed, and calm. They saw an industrial power that produced trucks, planes, and ships by the thousands while still keeping its stores filled and its civilians free from starvation. They saw women working in factories, not out of desperation but national determination. They saw a society that valued individual comfort yet possessed a strength that had carried thousands of miles across the oceans. It was in the simple interactions that ideological cracks widened. A guard handing a POW an extra Coke with a shrug. A farmer thanking POW laborers for helping with a harvest and giving them fresh fruit to take back to camp. American children approaching fences to wave at the prisoners, unafraid. A German lieutenant once asked an American sergeant why the guards treated the prisoners so gently. The sergeant replied, "Why wouldn't we? The war will end someday. You'll go home." No sense making enemies for life. The lieutenant wrote later that he had never heard such a sentiment from anyone in authority, German or otherwise. Some camps even hosted recreation events. There were soccer matches, boxing tournaments, and orchestra performances. German POWs played concerts for American audiences, surprising themselves by the applause they received. In return, American guards taught the prisoners baseball, a sport the Germans initially mocked before growing genuinely fond of it. These simple forms of cultural exchange softened the bitterness of war. Many POWs were shocked to discover that American citizens would come to watch their games, sometimes bringing lemonade or homemade treats. It was a kind of humane curiosity they had never imagined their enemies would show. As news of the conditions in American camps spread among German soldiers, those still fighting grew skeptical, but captured soldiers swore the stories were true. When fresh POWs arrived from the front, exhausted and terrified, older prisoners would greet them with smiles and tell them they would soon feast like kings. The newcomers usually refused to believe it until their first meal proved otherwise. More than one German officer found himself speechless when he tasted real ice cream after years of substitutes made from artificial powders. Not all POWs had the same experience, of course. There were incidents of conflict, escape attempts, and ideological diehards who tried to intimidate fellow prisoners. But overall, historians such as Arnold Krammer later confirmed that the United States treated German POWs with an unprecedented level of humanity. The American goal was not merely to detain them but to demonstrate the moral and economic power of a democratic society. In doing so, the United States achieved something unexpected. It changed hearts. One POW remembered a moment that shaped his view forever. Working on an American farm, he saw the farmer's young son throw half of his sandwich into a bin because he didn't like the filling. The German laborer stared at the discarded bread as if looking at treasure. The farmer noticed and quickly apologized, offering him a fresh sandwich. The POW accepted it gratefully but kept thinking about the waste. He later wrote that he realized in that moment that America had so much food that it could afford preferences. In Germany, hunger was not selective. People ate what they could find. That sandwich became a symbol of the unimaginable distance between their worlds. As the war came to a close, many German prisoners found themselves torn between relief and fear. They wanted to go home, yet they dreaded returning to a country shattered by bombing campaigns, shortages, and political collapse. For years they had lived in America with enough food, enough rest, and enough security to regain their physical strength. Returning to the ruins of their homeland would be a painful shock. But the Americans prepared them for departure with the same practicality and respect shown throughout their captivity. They were given farewell meals, medical checks, and even small packets of food for the journey. Many carried with them not just belongings but memories of kindness they had never expected from an enemy. When the ships finally took them back across the Atlantic, many prisoners looked back at the American coastline with complex emotions: gratitude, confusion, admiration, and a growing sense that everything they had been taught about America had been a lie. Some wept quietly, not out of sadness but deep bewilderment. They had come to understand that the war had been built on illusions. The ideology that had sent them marching into battle had insisted that Americans were weak, corrupt, inferior. Instead, they had discovered that America's strength came not from cruelty or domination but from abundance, freedom, and a confidence that required no propaganda. Once in Germany, these former POWs frequently found themselves defending America in conversations with family, neighbors, and strangers. They described the food, the fairness, the massive farms and factories, the sense of personal liberty. They spoke of Coca-Cola, something so common in America yet so precious to explain at home. They recounted how ice cream had been served to them prisoners of war while German civilians were boiling weeds for soup. Their stories contradicted every myth the Nazi regime had used to justify the war. Many historians believe that these returning POWs played a quiet but powerful role in shaping Germany's post-war transformation. Their first-hand experiences helped dismantle anti-American sentiment and build support for democratic reconstruction. They became, unintentionally, ambassadors of the very values the United States hoped to promote. What had begun as an exercise in military necessity had become an ideological victory achieved without a single shot. One prisoner wrote later that the most profound lesson he learned in captivity had nothing to do with food or comfort. It was the realization that power could be expressed through generosity rather than fear. America had shown its enemies a society so prosperous, so secure, and so confident that it could extend dignity even to those who had fought against it. The image of a guard handing a POW an extra scoop of ice cream or an unopened chocolate bar became a symbol of a civilization that believed strength came from lifting others, not crushing them. In the decades that followed, many of those former prisoners visited the United States again, some emigrating permanently, others bringing their families to see the land that had shocked them in their youth. They revisited old campsites, now abandoned or converted into farmland. They stood at fences that no longer existed, remembering what it felt like to see both captivity and unexpected kindness on the same day. Some met the families of guards or farmers who had treated them well, expressing gratitude that had matured over time into lifelong respect. The story of German POWs in the United States is one of the most unusual chapters of World War I, not because of battle, but because of what happened after the fighting stopped. America won more than a military victory. It won an ideological one. It shattered the myths that had fueled Nazi fanaticism and replaced them with experiences that no propaganda could erase, and in the end, the instruments of that victory were not bombs or tanks but ice cream, chocolate bars, and bottles of Coca-Cola that fizzed with the taste of a world these soldiers had never imagined. These simple pleasures, offered to enemies in captivity, revealed a deeper truth. America's greatness was not only in its armies but in its abundance, its values, and its belief that even FOs deserved humanity. That realization changed thousands of lives quietly, gradually, and permanently as the prisoners carried the memory of American generosity back into a broken Europe, where new futures were waiting to be rebuilt.